The morning Homer Hudson rode into Salvation Creek. He was bleeding from 3 places and holding himself together with nothing but pride, and a worn leather belt cinched tight around his ribs. The town of Salvation Creek sat in the dry heart of New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1881, a small cluster of sun-bleached buildings pressed against the base of a red mesa like a child hiding behind its mother's skirt. There was a general store, a livery stable, a saloon that doubled as a barber shop on Sundays, a small white-painted church that the Reverend only visited twice a month, and a scattering of homes along the single dirt road that called itself Main Street with more ambition than accuracy. It was the kind of town that appeared on no important map, that attracted no particular attention from the growing railroads or the territorial government, and that suited its residents just fine. Homer Hudson was 31 years old, lean as a fence post, with dark hair pushed flat by years under a hat, and eyes the color of creek water after a hard rain gray-green, and carrying all manner of things stirred up from the bottom. He had ridden for the Cassidy cattle outfit up north for 6 years, which was 4 years longer than most men lasted on that particular job, and he had the scars to show for it. He had a ranch of his own, or what remained of one, 30 miles south of Salvation Creek, and he was riding toward it now after a cattle drive gone badly wrong outside of Santa Fe. The horse under him, a reliable buckskin mare named Duchess, picked her way carefully down the main road as though she understood her rider needed gentleness. Homer's left arm was wrapped in a strip of his own shirt. There was a gash along his jaw from a fence wire that had snapped back with vicious purpose. His ribs on the right side had been introduced violently to a steer's horn in the chaos of a stampede 3 days prior, and while he did not believe they were broken, he was increasingly less certain with every step Duchess took. He had intended to ride straight through Salvation Creek without stopping. He had water enough and enough dried beef to last the journey. But as Duchess ambled past the general store, he saw the sign painted on the window in careful, steady letters: DOYLE General Store and Post, supplies, dry goods, medicines, and beneath it in smaller script, letters written by appointment, reasonable rates. Homer pulled Duchess to a stop. He sat in the saddle for a long moment looking at those words, letters written. He had been carrying a duty in his chest for nearly 2 weeks now, a duty that sat on him heavier than the pain in his ribs, and he had been avoiding it with the same focused determination he applied to avoiding rattlesnakes and dishonest card players. He needed to write a letter. He could not write it himself, not because he was entirely without letters. He could read a bill of sale well enough and sign his own name without embarrassment, but because the kind of letter he needed to write required words that he did not possess, words that had a particular shape and weight that his hands and his limited education could not produce. He needed someone else's hands for this letter, someone steady, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. He climbed down from Duchess with more care than dignity, looped her reins over the hitching post, and walked through the door of Doyle General Store and Post. The interior was cool and smelled of cedar and dried herbs, and something faintly sweet that might have been molasses, or might have been the particular quality of the air in a well-kept place. Shelves ran floor to ceiling along both walls, stocked with bolts of calico and canvas, tins of coffee and tobacco, tools and medicines and rope. At the far end of the room was a wooden counter, and behind the counter was a woman. Rosa Doyle was 28 years old, though she carried herself with the settled authority of someone a decade older. She had dark hair pinned up with practical efficiency, a few strands escaping at her temples in the heat. Her eyes were the deep brown of good earth after rain, and they were sharp, the kind of sharp that came not from suspicion, but from the habit of seeing things clearly and seeing them whole. She wore a blue cotton dress with the sleeves rolled up past her elbows, and she was measuring out a length of ribbon for old Mrs. Castillo, who stood at the counter with the focused intensity of a woman for whom ribbon selection was a serious moral undertaking. Rosa glanced up when Homer entered. She registered his condition with a single efficient sweep of her eyes, the bound arm, the gashed jaw, the way he held himself slightly sideways to favor the right, and her expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted incrementally toward readiness, the way a person does when they recognize that a situation may require them. She finished with Mrs. Castillo, who collected her ribbon and her small parcel of coffee, and departed with the satisfied air of commerce well completed. Then Rosa turned her full attention to the man standing just inside her door. "You look like 3 miles of bad road," she said. It was not unkind. It was simply accurate. Homer took his hat off. It was a habit so ingrained he barely noticed doing it. "Yes, ma'am, I expect I do. You need doctoring before anything else." She came around the counter. "Sit down before you fall down." "I'm fine standing, thank you." "No, you are not." She pulled a wooden chair out from its place beside the window and set it with a firmness that indicated it was not a suggestion. "Sit." Homer sat. He would have argued with another person. He was not sure why he didn't argue with her, except that she spoke with a particular quality of certainty that made argument seem exhausting rather than principled. Rosa disappeared into the back room and returned with a tin box that she opened on the counter. She had clean cloth strips and a small bottle of carbolic solution, and she worked on his arm first, unwinding the makeshift bandage he'd applied himself and inspecting the wound beneath with the focused calm of someone who had done this kind of work before and found no theater in it. "Hold still," she said, and applied the carbolic, and Homer held still, because whatever his other failings, he had never been a man who made a fuss over pain. "There's a doctor in Canyon Wells," she said as she wrapped the wound in clean linen. 12 miles east. You should ride there. I'll be all right. Stubborn is not the same as strong, Mr. Hudson. Homer Hudson. Mr. Hudson." She tied off the bandage and looked at the gash on his jaw, which she cleaned with a damp cloth and left open to air, as it was not deep enough to require more. "What brought you through Salvation Creek?" "I saw your sign," he said. "The letters." She looked at him. "You need a letter written." "Yes, ma'am." She returned her supplies to the tin box and set it on the shelf behind the counter, and came to stand before him with her hands folded together, not clasped anxiously, but resting easy, the way capable hands rest when they are at home. "I charge 25 cents for a standard letter, more if it's lengthy or requires particular care in the language. The price includes the paper and the envelope." "That's fine." Homer turned his hat in his hands. He looked at the floor, which was swept clean. "I'd need some privacy for it, if that's possible. Mrs. Castillo is my last customer before noon. Come back at 11:30 and we'll have the place to ourselves." Homer looked up. There was no particular warmth in her offer, but there was no coldness either. She simply operated with an efficiency that did not waste motion or sentiment. He appreciated it. He appreciated it more, he thought, because he was very tired and in a considerable amount of pain, and the quality of her steadiness felt like something he could lean against without it giving way. "I'll do that," he said. He stood, put his hat back on, and took his leave. He watered Duchess at the trough behind the livery and spent the interim time in the shade on the saloon porch, sitting on a barrel with a glass of water. He did not drink spirits, having seen enough of what they did to men who rode lonely and thinking about the letter. The letter needed to go to Margaret Hollis, who was not precisely the love of Homer's life, but who was the love of his younger brother Theo's life. And Theo had died of typhoid fever 6 weeks ago at the age of 24, before he had gotten around to telling Margaret Hollis how he felt, or asking her to marry him, or doing any of the things he had been working himself up to for 2 full years. Homer had Theo's journal. He had found it in Theo's bunk at the cattle outfit after the burial, and he had read it with his jaw clenched and his eyes burning, because every page of that journal was full of Margaret Hollis, full of the particular and patient ache of a young man who loved someone from a distance and could not quite bring himself across it. And Homer had thought that someone ought to tell her, that she ought to know, that Theo deserved for someone to say, on his behalf, what he could no longer say for himself. But Homer Hudson was not a man built for that kind of saying. He worked cattle and he fixed fences and he rode hard country and he kept his own counsel, and the words that lived in Theo's journal, those round, living, vulnerable words were not words Homer's hands knew how to make. He needed a woman with words. He needed the kind of someone who wrote letters for a living and understood what it meant to say what could no longer be said in person. At 11:30, he walked back to Doyle General Store and Post. The door was open. Rosa was behind the counter, writing in a ledger. She looked up when he came in and produced a sheet of good writing paper, an envelope, and a pen with the calm efficiency of a woman who had been expecting him. "Sit," she said, indicating the chair she had drawn up to the opposite side of the counter. It was clear she had arranged the space intentionally, with a second chair for herself and the writing materials laid out between them like a bridge. Homer sat. He placed Theo's journal on the counter. Rosa looked at it. She did not reach for it or ask about it. She waited. Homer cleared his throat. He looked at the window for a moment, at the bright rectangle of New Mexico morning outside, and then he looked at the journal. And then, because there was no way to do this except by doing it, he told her about Theo. He told it without ornament, which was the only way he knew how to tell anything. He said Theo had been his younger brother by 7 years and the better of the two of them by any honest measure. He said Theo had died of typhoid in late March and had been buried on a hillside above the Pecos River, and that Homer had read his journal and found Margaret Holly's in nearly every entry for 2 years running, and that it seemed right to let her know what she had meant to a good man who was gone. Rosa listened without interrupting. She had her pen in her hand, but she did not write yet. She listened with the full quality of her attention, which was a considerable thing, and Homer felt the peculiar and not entirely comfortable sensation of being genuinely heard. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What was his name?" Theo Hudson, 24 years old. And Margaret Holly's, did he know she was aware of him?" Homer shook his head. "She smiled at him sometimes in town. He wrote about that smile like it was something worth writing about." Rosa was quiet again. Then she picked up the pen. "Read me the parts you want her to know," she said. "From the journal, read them to me and I'll find the right words for the letter." Homer opened the journal. It was a small brown book with a cracked spine, and opening it felt like opening a door into a room he had no right to enter. He read slowly, haltingly, stopping sometimes when the words caught on something in his chest. He read the entry about the day Theo had first spoken to Margaret at the Mercantile in Red Fork, about how she had laughed at something the shopkeeper said, and the laugh had hit him like a physical thing. He read the entry about watching her ride out of town and feeling the whole landscape emptied by her absence. He read the last entry, written 5 days before Theo fell ill, which said simply, "I think tomorrow I will tell her. I think I have been waiting long enough." When he finished reading that last part, Homer closed the journal. His jaw was set. His eyes were dry. He was not a man who wept, but there was a quality to his silence that was the equivalent of it. Rosa had been writing. She had been writing the whole time he read, in a hand that moved with quiet purpose across the page. Now she set the pen down and looked at what she had made. Homer watched her read it back to herself. He watched her face as she read, and it was a careful face, a considered face, and then she looked up and began to read it aloud to him. She had not written what Homer had dictated. She had written something shaped from it, something that carried all the information and all the tenderness, and none of the rawness of a man reading his dead brother's most private thoughts. It was a letter that began by introducing herself, or, rather, the fictional writer, which was to be signed in Homer's name as Theo's brother, and moved into the territory of what Theo had felt with a gentleness that did not diminish the feeling but made it bearable for the person receiving it. It spoke of Margaret in terms that would not frighten or burden her with guilt, but would let her know she had mattered to someone good and worth knowing, and that the knowing of it was a gift rather than an obligation. It was, Homer thought, the finest thing he had heard in all his 31 years of living. He sat very still when she finished reading. Outside, A horse went past at a trot. Somewhere down the road, a dog was barking with great conviction at something of limited importance. "That's," Homer began. He stopped. He started again. "That's exactly right. That's precisely it." Rosa folded the letter with clean, practiced folds. She slid it into the envelope. "Who do I address it to?" she asked. "Miss Margaret Holly's," Homer said. "Red Fork, New Mexico Territory." Rosa dipped the pen and wrote the address. She wrote it in the same careful hand, each letter formed with consideration. Then she set the pen down and slid the envelope toward him. Homer reached for it, and as his fingers touched the edge of the envelope, he noticed something. Rosa was writing a second address. Not on the envelope she had just passed him, on a spare scrap of paper beside her writing materials. She was writing an address, and Homer, whose eyes were sharp from years of reading trail signs and weather, read it before she realized he was watching. The address she was writing was her own: Doyle General Store and Post, Salvation Creek, New Mexico Territory. Homer looked at her. Rosa looked at the scrap of paper with the expression of a woman who has been caught in the middle of something she intended to do privately. And the color that rose in her face was not precisely guilt, but was something adjacent to it, the color of a person discovered in an honest and undefended moment. The silence stretched. "What's that?" Homer asked. His voice was quiet, not accusatory, genuinely asking. Rosa set the pen down. She placed her hands flat on the counter in the manner of a person who has decided to meet something head-on. "It is the address I was going to write on an envelope for myself," she said. "To hold a copy of the letter." Homer waited. Rosa looked at him with those clear brown eyes. "I write letters for people who cannot write them for themselves. I have been doing it for 3 years since my husband died, and in all that time I have never written a letter that made me wish I were the one receiving it." She paused. "Yours is the first." The honesty of it sat between them like something solid and warm on the counter. Homer did not know what to do with it. He was a man built for action in wide open spaces, for roping cattle and reading weather and riding hard into difficult situations, and he had no particular architecture inside him for moments like this one. He picked up the envelope with the letter to Margaret Holly's and turned it in his hands. "Your husband," he said. It was not exactly a question. "James Doyle," Rosa said. "He died in the winter of 1879. He built this store and he built this town mostly, and then he died of pneumonia because he went out in a blizzard to help a neighbor's cow through a difficult birth, and the cow survived and James did not. There was grief in it, still present after 2 years, but it was grief of the settled, incorporated kind, the kind that has been lived with long enough to become part of the structure of a person rather than a disruption of it." Homer set the envelope down. He looked at this woman, at the rolled-up sleeves and the capable hands and the letter she had written for a dead young man's love, and he felt something shift inside his chest, in a region that was not the bruised ribs, in a region he had not paid much attention to for a very long time. "I'm sorry," he said, "about your husband." "I am sorry about your brother," she said. They looked at each other across the counter with the quiet frankness of two people who have just exchanged something of value and are not sure what to do next. Homer paid his 25 cents and left. He rode 20 miles south and then stopped, because Duchess was tired and his ribs were worse and the sun was dropping, and he made camp in the shadow of a juniper grove with the smell of dry sage all around him. He lay on his back looking at the enormous arch of New Mexico night sky and thought about Rosa Doyle and the address she had written to herself, and the feeling she had described. The feeling of wanting to receive a letter like that. The feeling of wanting someone to know what she was worth. Homer lay in the dark for a long time, and then he did something he had not done in years. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the small, battered notebook he carried for trail notes, recording miles and water sources and weather observations, and he found a blank page near the back, and he began to write. He wrote badly. He wrote with the cramped, unpracticed hand of a man who uses writing only when necessary and never for pleasure. The words came out sideways and incomplete, more like the marks of someone pushing through brush than the clear passage of a road. But he wrote anyway, because something needed saying and he had no one to say it to. And the night was large and quiet and patient, and the words, clumsy as they were better than the silence. He wrote about the way she had listened. He wrote about the steadiness of her. He wrote about the way she had written a letter for his dead brother with such care that it felt like a thing given freely rather than a service rendered for coin. He stopped writing after a page and folded the notebook closed. He did not tear the page out. He simply closed it and put it back and went to sleep, with Duchess's soft breathing nearby and the coyotes calling somewhere in the distance. And in his sleep, he did not dream of dead brothers or lost cattle or the hard years behind him. He dreamed of a woman with steady hands and clear brown eyes, writing in a room that smelled of cedar and molasses. He mailed the letter to Margaret Holly's from the post office in Canyon Wells the next day. After the doctor there had looked at his ribs, 2 cracked, not broken, he was told, which matched his own assessment and wrapped them properly and charged him $1.50. He stood at the post office window with the envelope in his hand for a moment before he passed it through, feeling the finality of it, the sense of a door being properly closed, and something else underneath it, something like the sense of a door being properly opened. He rode the last 10 miles to his ranch in the late afternoon of the following day, crossing his own land at the fence line his father had put up 30 years ago, and which Homer had mended and remended until there was more of Homer in it than of his father. And he felt, as he always felt coming home, the particular mixture of relief and loneliness that defined his life in this place. The ranch was modest. A house of 3 rooms, a barn that needed new boards on the south side, a corral and a water tank and 50 acres of grazable land, with another 100 acres of rough country that ran up toward the mesa. It was a place he had built and rebuilt and intended to hold, and it was a good place, and it was too quiet. It had been too quiet since Theo died. Theo had lived here in the winters between cattle drives, sleeping in the small back room and filling the kitchen with the noise of a young man who found everything interesting and had an opinion about most of it. The kitchen was very quiet now. Homer cooked himself a meal of salt pork and cornbread and sat at the table and ate it and thought about Rosa Doyle, which was not the first time he had thought about her in the 2 days since he'd left her store, and which would not, he suspected, be the last. He had no particular plan. He was not a man of particular plans. He was a man of practical steps, of doing the next thing that needed doing. And the next thing that needed doing, it seemed to him, was to find a reason to go back to Salvation Creek. The reason arrived in the form of his supply list, which he had been putting off assembling, and which, when he got around to it 3 days later, was substantial enough to justify a trip to a general store. His own nearest store in Canyon Wells carried the basics. But Canyon Wells did not have Doyle General Store and Post, which had a particular quality of stocking that he had noted on his one brief visit, and which was, when he considered the distances involved, not significantly farther. He told himself this was about supplies. He told himself this with the specific care of a man who knows he is not being entirely honest, but is not quite ready to examine the dishonesty directly. He hitched his wagon, a 4-wheeled freight wagon he used for supply runs, more practical than the saddle when carrying weight, and drove the 30 miles north to Salvation Creek on a morning in early May that was clear and fine and smelled of blooming sage. He arrived mid-morning. The store was busy with 2 customers he did not recognize, and Rosa was behind the counter with the same efficient competence he remembered. She looked up when he came in and something crossed her face that was quickly replaced by her customary steadiness, something that might have been surprise or might have been something else, warmer and more complicated. "Mr. Hudson," she said. "Mrs. Doyle." He held out his supply list. "I need these things if you have them." She took the list and read it without comment, which was fine, as it was an unsentimental list: flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil, nails, a new axe handle, cartridges for his rifle, and a length of good rope. She began assembling the order with the quiet efficiency that seemed to characterize everything she did. The other customers completed their business and left. Homer leaned against the counter and watched Rosa move through the store, lifting and carrying and calculating in her head, and the morning light came in through the front windows and lay itself across the shelves and the floor in long golden bars. And Homer Hudson, who had not felt the quality of a moment in a very long time, felt this one. "How are the ribs?" she asked without looking at him. "Better. Doctor in Canyon Wells wrapped them right." "You went to the doctor?" She sounded moderately surprised. "You said to." She turned to look at him then, with an expression that was not quite a smile but contained the elements of one, restrained into something more measured. "I didn't think you would. I'm more reasonable than I look. You looked like a man who planned to hold himself together with willpower and leather." "That was the first plan," Homer admitted. "Your plan was better." She turned back to the shelving. There was a pause that was comfortable rather than awkward, the kind of pause between people who are finding that the space between them is not empty but full. "The letter," Rosa said. "Did it reach her?" "I mailed it from Canyon Wells." "I expect it will reach her this week if the post is running on time." Rosa nodded. She continued assembling his order. Then she said, "You read well, from the journal. You read it like you knew what it meant." Homer was quiet for a moment. "He was my brother," he said. "I knew him. I knew every expression on that page because I'd seen them on his face." He paused. "He deserved better than dying at 24 without anyone knowing." Rosa set down the lamp oil and looked at him directly. The morning light was on her face and she did not squint against it but met it, the way she met most things. "He had a brother who rode 30 miles and paid 25 cents and read his private journal aloud to a stranger," she said. "That is not nothing." Homer had no answer to that. He looked at her for a moment and then looked at the counter. Rosa totaled his order $2.40, and Homer paid and loaded the wagon, carrying the heavier items himself with the slight careful quality of a man managing cracked ribs. And when he was done, he stood beside the wagon with his hat in his hands, and there was a quality to the morning, to the dust and the light and the smell of sage and the small busy sounds of Salvation Creek going about its day, that made him not want to get in the wagon yet. "I expect I'll need to come back in about 3 weeks," he said. "When this runs out." "I'll be here," said Rosa Doyle. He came back in 2 weeks. He told himself he had run out of coffee, which was true, and did not examine the other truth, which was that he had been thinking about Rosa Doyle with increasing frequency, and had resorted to cutting his coffee ration in half so the supply ran faster. The second visit was longer than the first. The store was quiet when he arrived, and Rosa had him sit at the counter while she sorted a delivery of dry goods that had arrived from Santa Fe, and they talked while she worked, which was the way of it with her. She was always working, never idle, and conversation happened alongside tasks rather than in place of them, which suited Homer precisely, as he was the same. He told her about his ranch, about the south side of the barn that needed new boards, about the 50 cattle he ran, and the plans he had for expanding when the market conditions allowed. She told him about the store, about how James had started it in 1875 when Salvation Creek was 2 buildings and a water source, about how she had helped him build it from a trading post into a proper general store and post office, about how after he died she had kept it running because there was no one else, and because she was good at it, and because it was hers. "Do you have children?" Homer asked, and then wished he had asked it more delicately, because it was an abrupt question and not what he would have chosen to lead with. Rosa's expression shifted in a way that was brief and complicated and then settled. "We had a daughter," she said. "She died in her first year, before James." She said it plainly, with the plainness of grief so old it had become part of the bedrock. "I'm sorry," Homer said. He said it the same way he had said it about James, simply, without reaching for more. "Thank you," Rosa said, the same way she had thanked him before. They were quiet for a moment, comfortable with it. "Do you want more children?" she asked, and then she looked up from the bolt of fabric she was refolding with an expression that acknowledged the boldness of the question. That was forward of me. It's a fair question, Homer said. He thought about it honestly, as he thought about most things. I do. I think a house should have more in it than one person. He paused. I spent most of my 20s believing that was something I'd get around to. Now I'm 31 and the house is very quiet. Rosa looked at him with those clear brown eyes. I know something about that quiet, she said. He drove home that evening feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, something that might have been called hope if he had been the kind of man who named his feelings, which he generally was not. He was the kind of man who simply kept moving in the direction the feeling pointed. He came back in 10 days, this time without the pretense of running out of anything. He brought her a jar of honey from the wild hive he'd found in the hollow of a cottonwood on his property. Not an elaborate gift, not something that declared itself loudly, but something made of effort and thoughtfulness and the particular sweetness of this territory. He set it on the counter and said nothing about what it was meant to communicate, and she picked it up and held it in both hands with a warmth in her face that said she understood perfectly. Come to supper, she said, if you have no objection to eating with a widow and her store cat. Homer had absolutely no objection. He ate supper with Rosa in the small kitchen at the back of the store, which was also the front room of the house she lived in behind the shop, a house of 4 neat rooms with braided rugs and good sturdy furniture, and a kitchen garden visible through the back window. The store cat, a large orange tom named Brick, who regarded Homer with the specific scrutiny of an animal assessing territorial claims, eventually accepted a small piece of salt pork and settled into civil neutrality. Rosa cooked beans and salt pork and cornbread and set it on the table with the ease of a woman who is neither performing hospitality nor apologizing for the simplicity of it, and Homer ate with the appetite of a man who had been cooking for himself for too long. They talked through the meal and into the evening, and when the light was low and the lamp was lit, Homer looked across the table at this woman and felt with sudden clarity that he was in a very great deal of trouble. Not the bad kind. The kind that arrives when a thing you didn't know you were looking for turns out to have been there all along, waiting. He rode home under the stars with his hands loose on the reins and Duchess moving steady beneath him, and he thought about Rosa Doyle with a fullness that was new. That was not the tentative or provisional thinking of the past weeks, but something committed and certain, the way a compass needle settles when it finds north. He came back the following week, and the week after that, and the visits acquired a rhythm and a warmth that neither of them named directly, because neither of them was the type for premature naming, but that was unmistakable to anyone who saw them together. Old Mr. Finch, who played checkers on the porch of the saloon every afternoon, remarked to anyone who would listen that Homer Hudson was buying more supplies than any single man could possibly use. Mrs. Castillo, who noticed everything, said nothing, but smiled into her ribbon selection with private satisfaction. On a warm evening in late May, Homer sat at Rosa's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the particular kind of peace that settles over a person when they are exactly where they ought to be, and he said, I want to be honest with you. Rosa looked up from her mending. All right, she said. I came back the second time because I needed coffee, Homer said. I came back the third time because I wanted to see you. I've been coming back every week since because I have not found any reason to stop. He held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at her steadily. I don't know what you make of that. I'd like to know if you're willing to tell me. Rosa set down her mending. She looked at him the way she did most things, directly and without theater. I make of it, she said slowly, that you are a man who does not say things he does not mean, and I have been making an extra pot of coffee on the days I expect you, which I do not do for other customers. Homer smiled. It was not a frequent expression for him, and it had a particular quality because of its rarity. It was whole and unguarded and changed the entire geography of his face. That's encouraging, he said. Rosa smiled back at him, and it was not the restrained almost smile he had been seeing for weeks, but the full version, the one she reserved for moments that earned it, and it was something worth riding 30 miles for. They were not young, either of them. They were not inexperienced. They had both carried losses and built things in the wake of them, and neither of them had any interest in pretending the world was simpler than it was. What developed between them over the weeks that followed was not the quick, bright fire of first young love, but something slower and more substantial. Something built on the accumulating weight of honest conversations and shared meals, and the quality of two people discovering that the person across the table from them is unexpectedly, reliably, genuinely good. Homer told her about the years with the Cassidy cattle outfit, about the life of a working cowboy on the long drives, sleeping on the ground and pushing cattle through weather that had no particular respect for human preference. He told her about buying his own land, about the satisfaction and the loneliness of it in equal measure. He told her about his parents, both gone, his father to age, his mother to a fever when Homer was 12, and about Theo, who had been the liveliest part of a life that was otherwise largely made of hard work and wide open spaces. Rosa told him about growing up in Santa Fe, the daughter of a Mexican storekeeper and a Tejana mother, about the particular position of a woman who existed between worlds in a territory where the lines between those worlds were drawn with more force than justice warranted. She told him about meeting James Doyle, a young man from Missouri with big plans and honest eyes, about following him to the raw young settlement of Salvation Creek with nothing but confidence in him and the future. She told him about the years of building, about the joy and the hardship of it, about James's death and the grief and the waking up on the other side of it. "I was so angry at first," she said one evening. "Not at James, but at the situation, the injustice of it. He was a good man who did a good thing, and it killed him. And then the store was mine, and the decisions were mine, and I was a widow in a territory where a woman alone had to be twice as capable to get half the respect." She looked at Homer with a frankness that was also a small challenge, seeing how he would receive what she was saying. "I have worked very hard to be seen as a person of substance here, not just James Doyle's widow, Rosa Doyle." "You are," Homer said without hesitation. "I saw that within 5 minutes of walking through your door. I saw a woman who ran a good clean operation and knew her business and didn't have any patience for anything less than straight dealing." "Most men see the widow first," Rosa said. "Most men are not paying attention," Homer said. She looked at him. There was a quality in her gaze that was assessment and recognition together, the look of a person confirming something they had begun to believe. "No," she said, "I suppose they are not." In early June, a letter arrived at Doyle General Store and Post, addressed to Homer Hudson, care of Rosa Doyle. He was there when it arrived, as he was there most days now, and Rosa handed it to him with a look that had question and warmth in it together. It was from Margaret Hollis. Homer opened it at the kitchen table with Rosa sitting across from him, not reading over his shoulder but present in the room, which was the right way to be present. He read it with the same careful quality with which he did most things, his eyes moving slowly down the single page. Margaret Hollis wrote that she had received the letter, and that it had undone her in ways she was still assembling herself from. She wrote that she had not fully known, that Theo Hudson had carried such feeling, though she had wondered, had hoped, and had been too uncertain to act on the wondering. She wrote that she was deeply sorry for Homer's loss, and that the kindness of telling her mattered to her in a way she would carry always. And she wrote, in her last paragraph, that she had met a kind man in Red Fork the previous winter, a schoolteacher named William Court, and that they had been corresponding, and that she was going to allow herself to be happy, partly because of what the letter had told her. That love was not something to be put off until the perfect moment, because the perfect moment had a habit of not arriving. She thanked the letter writer, which was Rosa, though she did not know it, for the quality of the language and the care of the telling. Homer set the letter down. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Rosa. "She's all right," he said. "She's going to be all right." Rosa's eyes were soft. "Good," she said. "That's good." Homer looked at the letter in his hand and then at the woman across the table, and he thought about Theo's journal and the words in it about the last entry. "I think tomorrow I will tell her. I think I have been waiting long enough," and something very certain and very quiet moved through him. "I have been thinking," Homer said, "about asking you if you would consider—" He stopped. He tried again. "About whether you might want—" He stopped again. He set the letter down. He looked at her directly. "I am not good with words," he said. "You know that." "I know it," Rosa said. "You are good with words," he said. "You wrote me a letter I couldn't have written myself, and I have been thinking about that. About what it means to need someone for the things you can't do alone." He looked at her steadily. "I need you, Rosa, not just for words, for everything. I want to ask you to let me court you properly if that's something you want. I want to ask if there is a chance." "Homer," Rosa said. He stopped. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "I hadn't finished asking." "I know," she said. "The answer is yes anyway." They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the lamplight, with Brick the cat watching from the corner and the smell of coffee and sage and cedar in the air. And the particular quality of the moment was such that neither of them moved to break it quickly, but sat in it for a moment, like people who understand when something worth keeping is happening. The courtship of Homer Hudson and Rosa Doyle was, by the standards of the territory, both brief and thorough. Brief because they were both practical people of mature feeling who had already spent several weeks establishing the substance of each other's character and found it sound. Thorough because neither of them was interested in performance. They were interested in reality, and the reality of their time together deepened steadily through June and into July. Homer began spending 2 or 3 days a week in Salvation Creek rather than one, and on the days he was at his ranch, he found himself calculating the time until the next trip with an exactitude that amused him when he noticed it. He made real improvements to the ranch during this time, as a man does when the future begins to look specific and inhabited. He fixed the south wall of the barn properly, not just the patch job he had been putting off, and he replanted the kitchen garden that had gone to weeds since Theo's absence. And he cleaned and aired and mended the house with the thoroughness of someone preparing it to be more than one person's shelter. Rosa continued running the store with the same steady competence, but there was a lightness to her that Mrs. Castillo remarked upon with great approval, and Mr. Finch observed from the Checkers porch, with the satisfaction of a man who had predicted it. She was not a woman diminished by practicality, but there was a way in which she had been operating at a level of pure functional self-sufficiency that was admirable and also lonely, and now there was something beside the function. She and Homer argued once properly in early July. It was over a decision Homer had made about a business arrangement with a cattle broker from Santa Fe named Kellerman, who was offering a contract that Homer thought was fair, and Rosa, who had seen Kellerman's ledger on a supply order the previous year, thought was not. She told him clearly and without softening what she knew, and he listened. And then he said she was wrong, and she said she was not wrong, and the argument had the quality of two people with strong minds taking a position and defending it, which is a different and more honest thing than fighting from hurt. In the end, Rosa produced the ledger and showed him the discrepancy in Kellerman's previous accounting, and Homer looked at it for a long time and then said, "You're right. I apologize." "For the argument?" Rosa asked. "For not listening faster," Homer said. "You had a reason and I should have heard it before I disagreed." Rosa looked at him with the expression she had, the one that was assessment and warmth and something close to astonishment. "Most men in this territory," she said, "would not say that." "I have already established I am not most men," Homer said. "You have established that," Rosa agreed, and there was a warmth in her voice that had nothing restrained about it. In late July, Homer rode into Salvation Creek early on a Saturday morning before the store opened and knocked at the back door of Rosa's house. When she answered, still in her work dress with her hair not yet pinned, she looked startled and then looked at his face and stopped looking startled. "Something's happened," she said. "Nothing bad," Homer said quickly. "Can I come in?" She stepped back and let him in. He stood in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, and he had clearly thought about what he was going to say but had not managed to work it into elegant form, which was consistent and also somehow the right thing for this moment. "I had Theo's ring," he said. "My father gave it to Theo, and I had it from his things after he died, and I've been carrying it for 2 months not knowing what to do with it. And last night I thought about what Theo wrote in that last entry, about waiting long enough." Homer reached into his vest pocket and produced a simple gold ring, thin and unadorned, the kind of ring a man of modest means buys when he intends permanence and not show. This was going to be for Margaret Holly's. But Theo is gone, and Margaret is going to be happy with someone else, and this ring has been sitting in my pocket while I have been driving 30 miles 2 and 3 times a week to sit in your kitchen and eat your cooking and listen to you think. He looked at her with gray-green eyes that were absolutely clear. "Rosa, I am asking you to marry me. I'm asking you to come to my ranch or to stay here and let me come to you, whatever makes sense for your life and your store. I'm asking you to be my wife, because the house is too quiet and I know myself well enough to know that what I feel for you is not something I want to put off until tomorrow." Rosa stood in her kitchen in the morning light with her hair loose and her hands still, and her face open in a way he had not seen before, all the practiced steadiness in abeyance for a moment, and she was extraordinarily beautiful. "I will marry you," she said, "and we'll work out the rest." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and she met him. And the first time he kissed Rosa Doyle, it was in her own kitchen, with the morning sun coming through the window, and the store cat asleep on the stool. And it was the realest thing Homer Hudson had experienced in 31 years of living in a very real world. They were married in September of 1881, in the small white church of Salvation Creek, with Reverend Howell presiding on one of his twice-monthly visits, and the entire town in attendance because, in a town of Salvation Creek size, a wedding was a civic occasion. Mrs. Castillo cried with magnificent thoroughness. Mr. Finch wore his good coat for the first time in 4 years. 2 of Homer's former riding companions from the Cassidy outfit came down from Santa Fe, weathered men who looked at Rosa with the immediate respect she generated, and said afterward to Homer that he had done better than he deserved, which was the highest compliment available in that particular social circle. Rosa wore a dress of deep blue that she had made herself in the 3 weeks since the engagement. From fabric she had ordered without telling anyone, and worked on in the evenings after the store closed. It was not an elaborate dress, but it was beautifully made, with the same quality of care she brought to everything. And Homer, seeing her at the church door, stood still for a moment with a look on his face that Mrs. Castillo would describe to her sister in Albuquerque as the most romantic thing she had ever witnessed in 40 years of attending weddings. They held the wedding supper in the street, as Salvation Creek had no building large enough for the gathering, and the September evening was warm and dry and full of stars, and somebody had brought a fiddle and somebody else had brought a guitar, and the music that came up from the street was the real kind, the kind that lives in the body and in the bones, and Homer Hudson, who had never in his life been observed dancing, danced with his wife in the street of Salvation Creek under the New Mexico stars with a quality of joy that was visible from 20 yards. The arrangement they had agreed upon was practical and honest, which was the nature of their agreements. Rosa would keep the store. It was her business, built by her hands and her management, and she was good at it, and the town needed it, and she had no intention of giving it up, and Homer had no interest in asking her to. Homer would keep the ranch, running his cattle and managing his land. On the days he was not needed at the ranch, he would be in Salvation Creek, and on the days Rosa could leave the store to the assistant she was in the process of hiring, she would ride out to the ranch. They were 30 miles from each other on the days they were not together, which was not ideal, but it was honest and workable. The assistant Rosa hired was a young woman named Delia Vega, the 16-year-old daughter of a local farming family who had a quick mind and steady hands, and took to the work with the focused pleasure of someone who has found something they are good at. Within a month, Rosa trusted her with the counter on her own, which freed Rosa to spend real time at the ranch rather than the careful rationed hours she had been managing before. The ranch in autumn was a different place from the quiet, somewhat depleted place Homer had been keeping on his own. Rosa brought with her the same quality of habitation she brought to everything, a way of filling a space with order and warmth without making it look like effort, and the house that had been too quiet acquired a different sound. Not louder, exactly, but fuller, the way a room sounds different when it contains the right things. Homer was not a sentimental man, but he noticed. He noticed the way she moved through his kitchen with the assurance of a woman making it hers, reorganizing the shelves with a logic that was better than his own, and not commenting on the previous arrangement, except to note, once mildly, that having the salt above the flour instead of below it made everything in the category of seasoning much easier to locate. He noticed the way she sat in the evenings with her mending or her ledger books, working by lamplight with the same quiet industry she brought to all things, and the way the lamplight fell on her dark hair and her steady hands. He noticed that Brick, who had come to the ranch in a basket on Rosa's lap on the first trip out, and had assessed the property with feline thoroughness, had taken up residence on the front porch, and was already in the process of informing the local mouse population of the new management. In November, Homer and two of his neighbors, a man named Pete Angas and a former cavalry soldier named Douglas Webb, who had come to the territory after the war and built a small cattle operation south of Homer's, drove 100 head of beef cattle to the railhead at Las Vegas, New Mexico territory, which had been connected to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway earlier that year. It was a good drive and a good price, better than Homer had gotten the previous year from the overland buyers, and he came home with more money than he had seen in a single transaction in several years. He put most of it back into the ranch new stock, the barn repairs completed properly, a new water pump, and a portion of it he used for something he had been thinking about since the wedding. He rode into Salvation Creek in early December, and Rosa was behind the counter with Delia, training her on the post office procedures, and Homer came in and set a folded paper on the counter in front of Rosa. She opened it. It was a deed of land filed with the territorial office, recording a 10-acre parcel adjacent to Salvation Creek's existing town limits, transferred to the name of Rosa Doyle Hudson. Rosa looked at the document for a long moment. Then she looked at Homer. "The Fenwick property," Homer said. "Old Fenwick died in October, no heirs, the land was going to the county. I bought it at the county price. I thought if you ever wanted to expand the store, or build something, or just have more land that's yours." He paused. He looked slightly uncertain in the way of a man who has done something that he hopes is right but cannot be entirely sure. "I thought you should have something that has your name on it alone, not James's name or mine, just yours." Rosa stood at the counter in her store in early December holding a deed of land, and the expression on her face was the one Homer had seen only a few times, the open one, the one without the practiced steadiness, the one underneath. "Homer," she said, her voice was not quite steady. "Do you like it?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She set the deed down carefully on the counter. She looked at him. "I like it very much." She came around the counter and took his face in her hands and kissed him in front of Delia Vega and two customers from the farming community south of town. And Delia Vega turned tactfully to organize the ribbon shelf with exceptional focus. And the two farming customers looked at the ceiling with the dignified restraint of people who have walked into something they respect. The winter of 1881 into 1882 was hard cold with real snow in January, the kind that closed the roads for a week and brought the cattle close to the water tank and made the ranch a world unto itself. Homer and Rosa spent those weeks at the ranch together, closer than they had been since the wedding by virtue of the world having shrunk to manageable size, And what grew between them in those weeks was the kind of intimacy that does not require events or occasions, the ordinary daily deepening of two people who are genuinely good company for each other. Rosa taught Homer to play checkers properly. He had been playing it wrong for 20 years. He took instruction with the patience of a man who knows when he is out of his depth and has the good sense not to defend the inferior position. Homer taught Rosa to track weather by the look of the clouds over the mesa, to read the particular colors of sunset that meant wind was coming, to listen to the way the cattle moved when they were getting nervous about something in the environment. She learned it with the quick, organized intelligence that characterized her learning of everything, and within 2 weeks she was making predictions he had to concede were accurate. In February, Rosa told Homer she thought she was carrying a child. She told him in the kitchen over breakfast, setting down her coffee cup and looking at him across the table with the directness that was her way of meeting everything, good news and hard news alike. She said it in the same measured tone she used for most things, but underneath it was something that was not quite calmness, something alive and a little breathless, and her hands around the coffee cup were holding it more tightly than usual. Homer sat very still for a moment after she told him. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Fairly certain," Rosa said. "I'll ride to see the doctor in Canyon Wells next week to be sure." Homer sat still for another moment, and then he stood up from the table and came around to her side and took her hands in his, coffee cup and all, and crouched down in front of her chair so he was looking up at her, which was not a position he occupied often and which somehow, for that reason, communicated everything. "Rosa," he said. His voice was rough at the edges in the way that feeling makes a voice when a man is not practiced at showing feeling. "I know," she said. She looked at him with eyes that were bright and steady together. "I know." He rested his forehead against their joined hands for a moment, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed saying. The doctor in Canyon Wells confirmed it in late February. Rosa was healthy and the pregnancy was proceeding as it ought, and the doctor, who remembered Homer from the visit for the cracked ribs, regarded the entire situation with the satisfaction of a man watching a story come right. News traveled fast in a town of Salvation Creek size. Rosa told Mrs. Castillo in late March when the pregnancy was showing clearly, and Mrs. Castillo communicated the information to the town with the thoroughness of a dedicated postal system. There were congratulations from every direction, from Pete Angas and Douglas Webb when they saw Homer at the spring roundup, from Reverend Howell on his next visit, from the farming families and the ranch families and Mr. Finch from the Checkers porch, who said he had seen this coming from the first time Homer Hudson hitched his wagon outside the general store, and that the only mystery was why it had taken so long. Rosa managed the store through the spring and into summer with Delia's capable assistance, doing less of the heavy lifting as the months passed and more of the organizing and the accounts and the letter-writing work, which continued to be a steady part of the business. People came to Rosa Doyle Hudson with their letters, still ranch hands who needed to write home, immigrants who were still finding their feet in English, the occasional man like Homer who needed someone else's words for something that mattered. She wrote each letter with the same care, and she charged what she charged, and the letters went out into the territory, and beyond it carrying the careful, honest language of a woman who understood what it meant when someone needed to say something true. Homer rode between the ranch and the town with the rhythm of a man managing 2 centers of gravity, which was occasionally logistically complicated and entirely worth it. He was good at the management of it, as he was good at the management of most practical things, and the road between the ranch and Salvation Creek had become, over the course of the year, as familiar as any fence line on his own property. In August of 1882, their son was born. The birth was in the house behind the store, with Mrs. Castillo and an experienced midwife named Catalina from the farming community assisting, and Homer in the front room of the store in a state of sustained, controlled anxiety That was the closest he came to expressing vulnerability. He could hear Rosa in the back room, and he could hear the voices of the women, and he sat on the bench by the front window with his hands on his knees and waited with the focused intensity of a man who knows this is not a situation where action helps, and finds that knowledge nearly intolerable. When Catalina opened the door and told him he could come in, Homer moved through the store faster than he had moved in a long time. Rosa was in the bed with a quality of exhaustion and radiance together that was specific to the moment and the occasion. She held a small, red-faced, fiercely present infant, and she looked at Homer when he came through the door with the whole measure of everything she felt, unguarded and unheld. "A boy," she said. "Come and see your son." Homer sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with the same quality of stillness he had shown when Rosa had first told him she was carrying. The child had dark hair like Rosa, like his grandmother, and was already protesting the state of the world with vigorous conviction. "He has opinions," Homer observed. "Like his father," Rosa said. Homer looked at her. He took her hand, the free one that was not cradling the child, and held it in both of his, and the look on his face was one that Rosa stored carefully for all the years that followed, the look of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was traveling to and finds it, against all calculation, exactly right. They named him Theodore James Hudson. Theo for the brother who had not lived long enough to tell his own love story, and James for the man who had built the town where this story had found its way to something good. It was the kind of naming that carries weight and meaning and also love, and the boy, growing into it, wore it as naturally as a well-made coat. Theodore James Hudson grew up between the ranch and the town with the easy capability of a child, raised in two good places by two people who were excellent at the things they did and paid real attention to each other and to him. He had his mother's quick intelligence and his father's steadiness and a laugh that belonged to no one before him, which is how the best things tend to work. The ranch expanded in 1883, when Homer partnered with Douglas Webb in a cattle enterprise that brought in a shared herd and required new fencing and a second hand at the ranch. A young Mexican-American man named Ernesto who was capable and honest and eventually became as fixed a part of the operation as the water tank and the south barn. The partnership with Webb was good business and became genuine friendship, which Homer, a man who had spent his best years in the company of cattle and open sky, took to with the slight surprise of someone discovering they are capable of more connection than they had supposed. Rosa expanded the store in 1884, using the Fenwick property to build a larger dry goods section and a proper post office counter with its own window. She hired a second assistant to work alongside Delia, who had by this time developed into a remarkably skilled shop manager, and who Rosa was in the process of teaching debentry bookkeeping with the concentrated pleasure of a teacher who has found an excellent student. The question of where they would eventually settle fully, whether the ranch or the town, resolved itself over time in the manner of most questions between people who are paying attention to reality, gradually, without either of them having to force it. What happened was that the ranch, over time, became their primary home, as Homer had always been a man who needed land under him, and Rosa, who had lived in the back of the store for 3 years after James died more from practical necessity than true preference, found that the ranch spoke to something in her that she had not known was waiting to be addressed. But the store remained hers, managed with Delia's increasing autonomy and Rosa's weekly presence, and the 10-acre deed with her name on it remained exactly that. And when people in Salvation Creek referred to the Doyle store, they meant Rosa's store, because she was Rosa Doyle Hudson, and the store was a thing she had built and run and sustained, and no one had given it to her. There were hard times, because there always are. The drought of 1885 took a quarter of Homer's cattle, and required difficult decisions and long months of careful rationing. Rosa's sister in Santa Fe died of scarlet fever that same year, and Rosa grieved with the quiet, thorough quality of her grief, and Homer sat with her in it without trying to fix it, which was the right thing to do, and which he had learned from watching the way she had sat with him when he had spoken of Theo. In the grieving and the weathering of hard things, they found themselves more firmly attached to each other rather than less, which is the mark of a thing built right. Theodore grew. He was 3 during the drought, grave and attentive in the way of children who sense the adults around them are worried, and he shadowed his father around the ranch and his mother around the store with the dedicated observation of a young person learning the world. By the time he was 5, he could name every tool in the barn and tell the difference between good accounting and bad, because these were the things his parents knew, and he absorbed knowledge from proximity, the way the soil absorbed rain. In the spring of 1886, Rosa told Homer she was expecting again. This time he was in the kitchen when she told him, and he received the news with the steadiness of a man who has been here before and knows its shape, but with no less feeling for the familiarity. He stood up from his chair and held her for a long moment with his face in her hair, and she let herself be held, leaning into the solid fact of him, and Theodore, who was 4, came in from the yard demanding to know if something was happening, which was exactly the right question. "Something is happening," Rosa told him. "You are going to have a brother or a sister." Theodore considered this with the gravity of a 4-year-old confronted with a significant change in his operational world. "Which one?" he asked. "We don't know yet," Homer said. Theodore accepted this with philosophical resignation and went back to the yard, where he had been conducting important work involving a stick and a patch of dirt, and Homer and Rosa looked at each other over his departing head with the specific joy of people who have enough to fully appreciate what they have. The second child, born in October of 1886, was a girl, and they named her Clara Rosalind Hudson, which gave her a piece of her mother's name and a particular sound that seemed to suit her from the first day. Clara Rosalind was from the beginning a different sort of person from her brother. Where Theodore was steady and observant, Clara was energetic and opinionated, arriving in every room with the immediate full presence of a person who has interesting things to do and no time to waste. She had Homer's gray-green eyes in a face shaped like Rosa's, and the combination was striking in a way that stopped strangers in their tracks. Theodore accepted his sister with the gracious generosity of a child who has been prepared well, and was also, it must be said, somewhat relieved to have someone new to talk to, as he had been talking to the ranch hand Ernesto and the horses for the better part of a year and felt the range of available conversation could be expanded. The years settled into the good shape of a life lived well. Homer rode his land and managed his cattle and continued to expand the ranch in careful, deliberate increments, and Rosa ran her store and wrote her letters and taught Delia everything she knew and watched Salvation Creek grow from a small settlement into a proper town, with a school built in 1887 and a second saloon, and a doctor who actually resided there from 1888 onward. She was on the school board from the day it was constituted, one of 2 women among 7 members, having made the case for her inclusion with the direct, documented efficiency that she brought to arguments she intended to win. Homer backed her on the school board without being asked, which was right and also the kind of thing that a man who has been married to Rosa Doyle Hudson for 6 years knows better than to be strategic about. She was right, she was capable, and her children were going to attend that school, and anyone who objected to a woman of her quality on a school board was going to need a better argument than tradition. The schoolteacher hired in 1887 was a young man of 22 from Ohio named Frederick Hayes, who was earnest and well-read and slightly overwhelmed by the particular quality of frontier children, and Rosa took him under her wing with the same maternal pragmatism she brought to most challenges, feeding him supper once a week, and giving him the kind of practical advice about surviving in the territory that was not available in any curriculum he had studied in Ohio. By his second year, Frederick Hayes had become something between a protege and a fixture of the household. And Theodore, who started school in 1888 at 6 years old, adored him with the specific ardor of a boy who has found an excellent teacher. Margaret Hollis's letter, the original one, from 1881, had led to Margaret Hollis Court, who had married her schoolteacher William Court and was living in Red Fork with 2 children of her own. Homer had written her once after Theo's ring became Rosa's wedding ring, to let her know in plain terms that the ring had found its right purpose, and Margaret had written back a letter of such warmth and generosity that Rosa had read it twice, and said it confirmed everything she had already believed about the basic capacity of people for goodness when given the chance to exercise it. In the spring of 1889, on a warm evening when the desert was beginning to put out its brief, extravagant bloom, and the air smelled of sage and wildflowers, and something indefinably alive, Homer and Rosa sat on the front porch of the ranch house, a porch Homer had built in 1884 specifically for the purpose of sitting on in the evenings, with Theodore doing his school reading in the lamplight inside, and Clara asleep in her bed after a day of extraordinary activity. And the quiet of the evening was the full kind, not the empty kind. Homer had his coffee and Rosa had her tea, and the stars were out in their usual magnificent excess, and after a long, easy silence, Rosa said, "Do you remember the letter?" Homer looked at her. He knew which letter. There had been many letters since, but there was only one that was the letter, the one at the beginning, the one she had written for Theo and then addressed to herself. "I remember everything," Homer said. Rosa looked at the stars. "I wrote that address down because I wanted to keep a copy of the letter," she said. "That was the honest reason. And the other honest reason was that I wanted a letter like that for myself. A letter that said someone had been watching and had found the watching worthwhile." She paused. "I didn't expect the man who'd brought me the letter to be the one to provide it." "Neither did I," Homer said. "I expected to ride through, mail Theo's letter, and ride home alone. Instead, you sat on my counter and let me clean your arm." "Instead, I sat on your counter," Homer agreed. "And you told me I was stubborn. I told you stubborn is not the same as strong. And then I went home and thought about that for a week." Rosa turned to look at him, and in the lamplight from inside the house in the warm spring dark, she was exactly and completely herself. The woman he had watched write with steady hands on a morning in 1881. The woman who had told him the truth about herself in the same breath she'd told it about the letter. The woman who had made a home out of 2 places and 2 lives and a partnership built on the genuine willingness to be known. "Homer," she said. "Yes," he said. "Write me a letter." He looked at her. "You know I can't write the kind of letter you write." "Write me the kind you can write," Rosa said. "The kind with the wrong spelling and the cramped hand and the wrong words in the right order." Homer was quiet for a moment. He thought about the notebook he had written in that first night, camped under the junipers with his bruised ribs and his dead brother's journal, and the image of a woman with steady hands. He had kept the notebook. It was in the drawer of the small desk in the bedroom, alongside the deed of land and Theo's journal and the letter from Margaret Hollis Court. He went inside and came back with the notebook and a pencil, and he sat on the porch in the spring dark with the lamp in the window behind him casting just enough light, and he wrote slowly and badly as he always wrote, with the cramped, unpracticed hand of a man who uses writing only for important things, which meant the writing itself carried the weight of importance. He wrote, "Rosa, I came into your store on a day in April 1881 with 3 injuries and 1 job to do. The job was to write a letter for a dead man. You wrote it better than I could have written anything. Then you wrote your own address on a scrap of paper, and I saw it, and I have been thinking about it ever since. I think about you every morning and every night and most of what is in between. I think the best day of my life was the morning I rode into Salvation Creek looking for the wrong thing and found the right one. You are the finest person I know. You are my home. I love you in ways I do not have the words for, but I am going to spend the rest of my life finding them." He tore the page out of the notebook and folded it once and held it in his hand. Then he looked at Rosa and said, I should probably tell you that the spelling is wrong in several places." "Give it to me anyway," Rosa said. He gave it to her. She unfolded it and read it in the lamplight from the window. He watched her read. He watched the expression on her face move through something that was not quite readable, but that was entirely right. The way a landscape looks when the light hits it correctly and shows you every contour clearly. When she finished, she folded it again, very carefully, with the same clean, precise fold she used for the letters she wrote for others, and she held it in both hands in her lap. "The spelling is not that bad," she said. Homer exhaled. "Good, Homer. Yes. I love you in ways I have all the words for," she said, "and still cannot say." He reached over and took her hand, the one not holding the letter, and they sat on the porch in the spring dark of 1889 with the stars overhead, and the desert blooming and Theodore's reading lamp visible through the window, and Clara asleep in her bed with her particular fierce energy at rest, and the ranch around them in the quiet, inhabited way of a place that is genuinely lived in, and the 30 miles between this porch and Salvation Creek, a distance that contained the whole of their story. The broken cowboy who had ridden in with his hurt and his duty, the widow who had written a letter that was meant for someone else and found it coming home to herself, and all the years between the writing of it and this moment, full of honest days and good work and children's voices, and the accumulated, ordinary, extraordinary fact of two people who had chosen each other fully and without reservation. Delia Vega ran the store with complete confidence now, and had been talking to the youngest of the Anga's sons with the careful mutual interest of two sensible people who are deciding something important. The school was thriving, with Frederick Hayes in his 3rd year and Theodore in his 2nd, and already reading at a level that made Frederick write a letter to his family in Ohio, describing the quality of Western frontier children, with considerable upward revision of his initial assessment. Clara would start school in 2 years, and everyone who knew her was already preparing for the experience. Homer's ranch had 40 more acres than when he had started, and good stock, and a reputation in the territory for honest dealing that was worth more than the acreage. Rosa's store was the foundation of Salvation Creek's commerce, and its post office was the town's connection to the wider world. And the letters she wrote for people continued to go out into the territory, carrying the careful, exact, human language of someone who understood what it meant when a person couldn't find their own words. In her desk in the back room of the store, in a cedar box with a small iron clasp, Rosa kept 3 things. The letter Homer had given her on the porch that spring evening, written in his cramped, difficult hand with the spelling somewhat wrong and every word of it true. The address she had written to herself on a scrap of paper on a morning in April 1881. And a copy in her own hand of the letter she had written for Theo, the letter that had been a service rendered for coin and had become, in the rendering, the beginning of everything else. She kept them because they were the shape of the story, the before and the middle and the arrived-at place, and because she believed in keeping the things that showed you how you got somewhere worth being. Homer knew about the cedar box. He had found it once while looking for the pen she kept in the desk, and had opened it without knowing what it contained, and had sat very still for a moment after seeing what was inside, and then had closed it and replaced it and gone back to the kitchen and said nothing, because it was hers and it was right that she kept it, and there was nothing to say about it that the keeping didn't already say better. The letter had been written for a dead young man's love, and had been addressed to a widow who wrote other people's words for a living, and had ended with a cowboy who could barely form a sentence sitting on a porch under the New Mexico stars, 40 years ahead of him, writing badly and honestly about the woman beside him, while their children slept inside, and the desert bloomed in the spring dark, and the whole wide world of the territory went about its business in the ordinary, extraordinary way of the world, doing what it always does, which is providing to those who are paying attention exactly as much as they are willing to receive. Theodore James Hudson grew up and studied law and came back to New Mexico territory to practice it, and was, by all accounts, a man of great clarity and steady honesty who could write a letter that said exactly what it needed to say, which people remarked upon as a gift, and which he knew came from his mother. Clara Rosalind Hudson grew up and ran a cattle operation of her own in the northern part of the territory, having developed by age 12 a grasp of cattle management that made her father simultaneously proud and slightly unsettled, and was known across 3 counties as a woman you did not try to cheat in a contract negotiation, which was the finest thing that could be said about anyone in that business. Delia Vega did marry the youngest Angus son, in a wedding at the church in Salvation Creek that Rosa organized with the same clear competence she brought to all organized things, and Delia continued at the store, and the Angus son continued his family's cattle work, and the 2 of them built something good, which Rosa had known they would from the moment she saw the way Delia looked at him when she thought no one was watching. Rosa Doyle Hudson wrote letters for 30 years, until the writing work was no longer needed in the same way because the territory was a state now, and the schooling was better and more people could write their own words. And when she stopped without regret, because she had done it well for as long as it was needed, and that was the right measure of any work. Homer Hudson ran his ranch until his 60s, when Theodore and the partners took on the heavy management, and Homer did what he liked, which was riding the land in the early mornings and sitting on the porch in the evenings, and occasionally, with significant concentration, writing things down in a notebook in his cramped, honest hand for no audience but his own private record and eventually Rosa's cedar box. They grew old in the good way, the way of people who have been genuinely useful and genuinely loved, and who have not wasted the years on pretending to be other than they were. They grew old with the particular ease of 2 people who still, after all the years, chose to sit together when they could choose anything, who still found the space between them full rather than empty, who still, when the light was right and the evening was quiet, turned to look at each other with the expression of people who know themselves to be exactly where they are supposed to be. And when anyone in Salvation Creek in the years after told the story, and they did tell it, because it was the kind of story that a town keeps and passes on, the way towns keep the things that define them, they told it like this. There was a widow who wrote letters, and there was a cowboy who rode in broken, and he asked her to help him write a letter for someone else, and she wrote it, and then she wrote the address on a scrap of paper and addressed it to herself, and the cowboy saw it, and that was how it started, and what it became was everything, which is to say it became a life, built honestly and well by 2 people who were paying attention. That was the truth of it. That was the whole of it. And it was more than enough.